Last year, I experienced something strange at a festival in the Nevada desert. This wasn't any ordinary festival. It's called Burning Man, a week-long arts festival where people gather to share art, music, and ideas. It takes place in the vast, empty Black Rock Desert, a place that feels like another world. Around 70,000 people go each year, and the spirit of the event is one of freedom, creativity, and openness to anything. For a few years, I've attended Burning Man and felt connected to its wild, artistic vibe. The festival can get intense, though. You have to bring everything you need for a week and take everything back with you. Each year, I leave inspired, having seen art installations that are one of a kind and met people with new perspectives. But last year, I encountered something I still can't fully explain. Every night, I took long walks in the desert to process the day's events. It's calming to step away from the lively parts of the festival and walk in silence under the stars. One night, I ventured farther out than usual. The deep blue sky was dotted with stars, and the only sound was the faint, distant beat of music. As I walked, the night felt surreal. The stars seemed close, almost within reach, and the landscape stretched out endlessly. It was like stepping into a dream. I felt totally at peace, enjoying the quiet, when something caught my eye in the distance. It looked like a figure standing alone in the open desert. At first, I thought it was a person, or maybe an art installation. But the figure shimmered, seeming to flicker in and out of view. I felt curious and walked closer, though a part of me wondered if I should turn back. When I was about 20 feet away, I could see it more clearly. This was no ordinary figure. It has thin, graceful limbs that seemed to shift colors under the moonlight, like a living gemstone. I stopped, trying to understand what I was looking at. It felt like I'd stepped into another world, like the creature was something from a dream or a far-off dimension. Its body looked almost transparent, blending with the surrounding desert. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I saw, it moved, not like a puppet or a person, but as if it were floating with the wind. It seemed alive, but not in any way I'd ever seen. The creature turned, and where a face might have been, there were only two glowing orbs, like eyes. I felt a connection, as if it were looking straight through me, right into my thoughts. Suddenly, I wasn't afraid. Instead, I felt calm, as if it were inviting me closer. Against all sense, I took a few more steps toward it, feeling like I was in a trance. When I was only a few feet away, the creature extended one of its arms toward me. Its arm was nearly transparent, and though I hesitated, I felt compelled to reach out. When my hand touched its outstretched limb, an overwhelming sensation washed over me. It was like we shared a single thought, a single feeling. In my mind, I saw flashes of stars, planets, and vast galaxies, places I had never been but somehow felt familiar. My head was filled with colors and sounds, images too vivid to explain. It was like looking into the universe itself, feeling both awe and wonder. The creature's arm withdrew, and it let out a sound, a soft musical note that reminded me of wind chimes and whispers. Before I could react, it started fading, blending back into the night until it disappeared completely, leaving me alone in the silent desert. I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was racing with questions. Was this a dream, or had I really met something beyond this world? Slowly, I made my way back to the camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd witnessed something extraordinary. The rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. When I told a few friends the next day, they looked both amazed and envious, but none of them had any answers for me. I realized I might never know what that creature was or why it had appeared to me, but it left me with a sense of wonder and a new perspective on life. I planned to go back to Burning Man again, hoping to encounter that creature once more. It was like a glimpse into something far greater than myself. That night in the desert, I found something I wasn't even looking for. And maybe that's the beauty of it. To know that some experiences aren't meant to be fully understood, just felt and cherished. My name is Ella, and I live on a quiet farm near the edge of Red Cedar Forest in Virginia. My best friend Carrie lives about a 10-minute walk away, and we both grew up exploring the woods, so they feel like home to us. But neither of us had ever experienced anything as strange as what happened that night. One afternoon, Carrie called me in a panic, saying she'd found odd footprints around her backyard, close to the woods. They looked almost like huge bare feet, but the toes seemed too long. I thought maybe it was a bear or something, but she insisted the prints didn't look like any animal we'd normally find in Virginia. That night, we decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, we headed out to follow the footprints into the forest. Our husbands thought we were crazy, but were used to our little adventures and let us go. Under the dimming sky, the woods were quiet, with only the crunch of leaves underfoot. We found the strange tracks just as Carrie had described, and oddly enough, they weren't alone. Next to the giant, bare footprints was a trail of smaller boot prints, like someone had been walking alongside this creature. As we continued into the trees, the feeling in the air grew tense, and an uneasy chill settled over us. The tracks took us through thick underbrush and into the darkest part of the forest. We felt watched, but the footprints were all we had to go on. Just when we thought we'd reached a dead end, we saw more of those enormous prints alongside a scattering of tiny, nearly unrecognizable ones, running in every direction. It looked like something had happened here, and we couldn't help but wonder, was someone following this creature? Or worse, was something following us? Before we could process it, a powerful smell hit us. Like skunk, but mixed with something even fouler. Then we heard something between a grunt and a snarl. We froze, barely breathing. I whispered to Carrie, "What do you think that was?" But she didn't answer, only gave me a wide-eyed look that told me she was just as spooked as I was. Suddenly, we heard something moving fast through the bushes. We swung our flashlights in all directions, but saw nothing. Just as we began to relax, something leapt from behind a tree, landing with a heavy thud on the ground before taking off again. We caught only a shadow, but whatever it was big, and it moved faster than anything human. We screamed, instinctively backing up, but there was nowhere to go but deeper into the forest. The noise grew louder as if branches were being snapped and rocks thrown. We had no idea what was happening or what we were facing, but we didn't wait to find out. We turned and bolted for home, not stopping until we saw the lights from Carrie's house peeking through the trees. When we finally made it back, we were breathless and shaky. Carrie's husband didn't believe us and teased us about letting our imaginations run wild. But we knew what we saw, or at least what we didn't see, and that was enough to keep us both up that night. A few nights later, Carrie called again, this time more worried. She'd heard strange howling coming from the woods outside her house. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried over. By the time I arrived, it was already late, and the forest was eerily quiet. I stayed over, and we slept fitfully, both of us waking at every creak or rustle outside. Just before dawn, while it was still dark, a loud crash broke the silence. It sounded like something heavy hitting a tree, followed by a series of distant, deep howls that echoed across the forest. We lay there wide-eyed, waiting for the sounds to pass. Morning finally came, and when Carrie's husband returned from his overnight shift, he suggested we call someone for help. But when we explained the situation to the local ranger, he seemed doubtful. "Could be coyotes," he said. "Maybe some pranksters." Without solid evidence, there's not much we can do. It wasn't the answer we'd hoped for, but we had no proof, just strange footprints, loud noises, and that musky, skunky smell lingering in the woods. In the days that followed, the noises quieted down, and though neither of us has seen any more tracks, I often find myself glancing over my shoulder, feeling as though we're still being watched. The memory of that strange, thudding shadow remains vivid in my mind, and I'm convinced there's something out there, lurking in the heart of Red Cedar Forest. On a chilly night in a quiet neighborhood outside of Houston, Mia and her husband Leo were on their way home from a family visit. It was a late, quiet night, past midnight, when they turned onto a road that stretched out before them, flanked by dark trees. The only light came from the distant streetlights and their car's headlights. As they approached a stoplight, Mia noticed something unusual. "Leo, do you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the top of the stoplight. There, perched like a statue against the sky, was a massive bird. Its silhouette was illuminated by the street lamp. The creature was huge, much bigger than any bird Mia had ever seen. She'd been fascinated with owls since childhood, but she'd never seen one this size. Its wings were spread wide, casting an ominous shadow. As they drew closer, the headlights revealed more details, and both of them gasped. The creature stood over 4 feet tall with a wingspan of at least 7 feet. "Is that an owl?" Leo asked, his voice filled with awe. "But owls don't get that big," Mia murmured, clutching the seat. She tried to reason with herself, wondering if it was just a trick of the light. But the closer they got, the more real it seemed. The creature's eyes were what struck Mia the most. They were dark and hollow, like deep black tunnels that seemed to look right through them. As the car slowed, Leo leaned closer to the windshield, captivated. "It's almost like it's waiting for something," he whispered, barely audible. The owl-like figure didn't move. It remained perched, staring directly at them as if it could see right into their thoughts. For a long moment, the world seemed to stand still. Mia felt a chill crawl up her spine as she gazed into those eyes that looked so empty, yet so intense. As they sat in the car, the creature shifted its wings slightly, causing Leo to tense. He could see how its feathers were ruffled and wild, unlike the sleek, graceful look of typical owls. "This isn't normal," he whispered. "Owls don't act like this, do they?" Mia shook her head, her gaze fixed on the strange creature. "Maybe it's not an owl," she said, trying to convince herself. But what else could it be? She glanced around, realizing there were no other cars in sight. The whole area seemed deserted, adding to the feeling that they'd stumbled upon something otherworldly. The creature tilted its head, as if considering them. Then, without warning, it hopped down from the stoplight and landed on the road. The movement was smooth, almost graceful, but the sight of it on the ground only made it seem more imposing. Its sheer size up close was intimidating, and Mia's heart raced. "Leo," she murmured, fear creeping into her voice. "Maybe we should just go." But Leo was captivated. He had always been curious about the unknown, and this creature was something he'd never imagined he'd see. "Maybe it's just a rare species," he suggested, though Mia could tell he didn't believe it himself. His eyes were glued to the creature, unable to look away. The creature took a step forward, and they could feel the subtle vibration of its weight on the ground. For a second, it seemed to look directly at them, and Mia felt as though it could see straight through her. Leo's hand moved toward the door handle, but she grabbed his arm, shaking her head. "No, don't," she pleaded softly. "Some things are better left alone." Leo looked at her, seeing the worry in her eyes, and nodded reluctantly. Slowly, he put the car in gear, and they began to move forward, passing the creature. As they drove away, neither of them spoke for a while. The silence in the car felt heavy, as if the creature's presence lingered with them. Finally, Mia broke the silence. "What do you think it was?" Leo shook his head, lost in thought. I don't know. Maybe it was something from somewhere else. His voice was quiet, filled with wonder and a hint of fear. Over the next few days, they tried to brush off the encounter as a strange, late-night hallucination, but every so often, Leo would bring it up. Do you think it could have been something not from here? He'd ask, his gaze distant. Mia didn't have any answers. She wasn't sure she even wanted them. The memory of the creature's gaze haunted her, and she often found herself staring out the window, wondering if it was still out there, somewhere. As the months passed, they drove that road many more times, but never saw the creature again. The memory of that night faded, but it was never fully gone. It lingered like a ghost, a strange, inexplicable experience that neither of them could forget. Once upon a time, a writer named Jamie traveled to the tallgrass prairie near Wichita, Kansas. Jamie loved this vast, open grassland, often visiting to gather inspiration. The prairie was calm and beautiful, filled with waving grass and wildflowers. For Jamie, it was the perfect place to escape from the noise of daily life and to find peace and creativity. One afternoon, Jamie set off down a narrow trail, ready to jot down any ideas that might come to mind. The sky was cloudy, and the air felt thick, like something was about to happen, though Jamie couldn't tell what it was. As Jamie walked, a strange feeling grew, a feeling that someone, or something, was nearby. At first, Jamie thought it was just the imagination at work, since writers tend to have vivid imaginations. But this was different. The sensation grew stronger until it felt almost like someone was whispering nearby. Pausing, Jamie listened closely, scanning the surroundings. The wind seemed to carry soft, hushed voices, so faint that Jamie couldn't make out any words. Curious and slightly nervous, Jamie decided to follow the sound, walking through the grass until coming upon a small clearing surrounded by wildflowers. Jamie saw something she had never seen before. It was a creature that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. Its body was made of grass, leaves, and flowers, blending perfectly with the prairie. It moved with a gentle, graceful sway, as if it were part of the wind. The creature's face was both kind and wise, with deep, thoughtful eyes. Jamie stood, amazed, too stunned to speak or even move. The creature seemed to notice Jamie, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. In that silent exchange, Jamie felt an understanding pass between them, as if the creature knew all the thoughts, dreams, and worries that Jamie carried. The whispers Jamie had heard earlier grew louder. Realizing the whispers were coming from the creature, Jamie listened closely. It wasn't speaking words, but rather sharing a feeling, a sense of ancient wisdom and stories that had been part of the land for centuries. It was like the prairie was alive, telling Jamie stories that only the wind and the grass knew. Unable to resist, Jamie reached out a hand to touch the creature, just to feel if it was real. But before the fingers could make contact, the creature took a gentle step back. With one last, knowing look, it melted back into the grass, disappearing so seamlessly that it seemed like it had never been there at all. The prairie was still once more, the whispers gone, leaving only the rustle of the wind and the calls of distant birds. Jamie stood alone, trying to hold on to every detail of the encounter, wanting to remember the creature's wise eyes and the feeling of ancient stories in the air. Deep inside, Jamie felt a powerful urge to write down everything that had just happened, but words couldn't quite capture the magic of the experience. Slowly, Jamie walked back along the trail, still marveling at what had just happened. It wasn't a scary encounter. Rather, it felt like Jamie had been granted a glimpse into the soul of the prairie. It was as if the land had chosen to share a piece of itself, to remind Jamie of the deep connection between people and nature. The prairie, the grass, the creatures, and humans. They were all part of a larger story, woven together like the grass in the wind. Once Jamie returned home, that memory stayed fresh, like a spark burning inside. Jamie wrote about it, pouring the experience into words that, even if they couldn't capture everything, still held a little of that wonder. Jamie knew that this was a story to be shared, a story of the magic hidden in the world around us. I grew up hearing the story of La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman, as if it were a legend passed down from my ancestors. In the small towns of Mexico, her story was a cautionary tale, meant to keep children close to home and away from rivers and lakes at night. They said she was a ghost, cursed to roam the waterways forever, crying for her children. I always thought it was just a spooky story, nothing more. But one night, when I was old enough to remember every detail, I came face to face with something that made me question everything. It was a warm summer night, and my family was visiting my uncle's house, far from the city. His house was old, with creaking floors and dim lights, and it sat near a narrow, winding river. The night was peaceful and calm, and everyone else had gone to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The moonlight was so bright, it felt like daylight, casting silver light on everything around me. Feeling restless, I decided to take a short walk down to the river. As I stepped outside, the silence was unnerving. There were no sounds of crickets, no rustling leaves, just a thick, quiet stillness. Even the air felt strange, colder and heavier as I got closer to the water. I walked slowly, feeling the damp grass beneath my feet and listening to the soft ripple of the river. It was so dark that the trees looked like towering shadows around me, closing in with every step. Just as I reached the riverbank, something made me stop. Standing a little farther down by the water was a figure. At first, I thought it was someone from town. But as my eyes adjusted to the moonlight, I realized it was a woman in a long white dress. She stood perfectly still, facing the water, with her head bowed. Her dress seemed to float, its edges brushing along the water like mist. Her hair was long and dark, hiding her face, and there was something so sorrowful about the way she stood there, like she was carrying a heavy burden. The longer I watched, the colder the air became. I felt a strange, indescribable sadness, as if her sorrow was spilling over into the night itself. Then suddenly, she began to sway slightly, her figure moving gently with the breeze. It was then that I heard it, a soft, haunting wail that seemed to drift on the air. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, filled with so much pain that it seemed to echo deep inside me. The woman lifted her head slowly, and though I couldn't see her face clearly, I could feel her eyes on me. I stood frozen, barely daring to breathe, afraid that any movement would catch her attention. The wailing grew louder, filling the night with an eerie, heart-wrenching sound. It was as if she were searching, crying out for something lost to her forever. In that chilling moment, I remembered what I'd heard about La Llorona. The story went that she had drowned her own children in a fit of rage and regret, only to realize too late what she had done. Her spirit, filled with endless grief, was doomed to wander rivers and lakes, searching for her children and weeping for them, night after night. People said that if you heard her cry, it meant she was close, and those who saw her face would meet a terrible fate. Just as I was thinking this, she turned toward me. Her face was ghastly pale, almost skeletal, her eyes empty yet piercing, as if they could see through me. I felt her sadness like a weight pressing down on my chest, and every part of me wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, as if something had frozen me in place. Her wail softened, and she held her hands out toward the water, her fingers curling as if grasping for something unseen. The sorrow in her cry was softer now, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I finally felt my legs start to move, and I began to back away slowly, trying not to make a sound. With each step, I felt the weight of her gaze. I didn't stop backing up until I felt the door of my uncle's house against my back. With shaking hands, I opened it and slipped inside, shutting it firmly behind me, and I knew I'd never be the same. La Llorona was more than a story. She was real. That night, I felt the weight of her grief, the endless sorrow of a mother who had lost everything.